When I think about genes in the environment, I often think about William Shakespeare, because Shakespeare wrote a play called The Tempest, and the plot of this play involves a shipwreck on an island, and on this island there lives a little devil whose name is Caliban. And the people who are shipwrecked try to be kind to this little devil, and he turns out to be completely awful. He won't cooperate with them, he won't help them, he's just a nuisance. And in great exasperation, one of them says to Caliban, "On thy foul nature, nurture will never stick." In other words, you were born so awful that nothing we can do to change your environment will make you better. And that's a very common fallacy when we're talking about genetics, the nature-nurture controversy. Not many people know that the nature-nurture phrase comes from Shakespeare. And Francis Galton, who was in some senses the founder of human genetics, was completely convinced, absolutely convinced, as was almost everybody else, that everything was in your nature, the way you were born. Okay, and he was an outstandingly good scientist. He made mistakes, but all scientists do. He wrote a book called Hereditary Genius, in which he pointed out that, for example, if your father had been a judge, and his father had been a judge, and his father had been a judge, it was quite likely that you'd be a judge. But he went further than that. He went up to Newcastle on Tyne, which is on a big river where people used to have rowing races, and he found indeed that people who were champion rowers, their fathers tends to be a champion rower, their grandfathers did, and their great-grandfathers did. And he did this for various attributes, and he found this happened again and again. And for him, this proved that everything was in your nature, in your biology, and that nothing you could do to change the environment would make any difference. Now, of course, he was completely wrong there. Okay, one of the things which is absolutely passed down from one generation to the next, often for many generations, is money. Most people who are millionaires in the modern world are millionaires because their parents were millionaires. That isn't true of everybody in this technological age, but it's been true for a long, long time. And there's no genes for money. So the mere existence of a hereditary pattern is a very weak insight to whether something's genetic or not. But many people still don't see that. If you type into Google the words scientists find the gene for, you get, last time I did it, something like 63,000 hits, okay? And given there's only 23,000 genes, that's quite impressive. But they're silly. Scientists find the gene for language. Scientists find the gene for unhappiness. Scientists find the gene for musicality. Scientists find the genes for height. All these things. But the most dangerous word in the science of genetics is the gene for something. Okay, because genes are just boring bits of DNA. They work in an environment, and without the environment they wouldn't be doing anything. And that's the extraordinary thing about knowing a certain amount about genetics. For the public, that makes the environment seem less important. For geneticists, it makes them seem more important. I often talk about a classic example of this, which is cat genetics. I have many examples from cat genetics. And one of them has to do with black cats and white cats. Now, we all know about black cats and we know about white cats. Charles Darwin actually found something interesting about white cats, that all blue-eyed white cats are deaf. Darwin found that. And the reason for that is that white cats cannot make the pigment that's called melanin. And that's the pigment which we've all got, which is, if you've got dark hair, it's got melanin in it. If you've got dark skin, you've got melanin in it. But it's also in your brain, in your ears, and various other places. So a black cat can make melanin in a kind of production line, a biochemical production line, which starts with simple chemicals and puts them together to make this complicated pigment. Okay? If one of the machines in that production line has broken down, the machinery will go up to that broken point and then go no further, and you'll have a white cat. Okay? So that's simple. But sometimes what happens is that the machine hasn't broken down, it's just been slightly damaged, so it doesn't work very well. And then you get some rather strange patterns in cats. The one I'll talk about is called the Siamese cat. I don't know what you call it in Russian, but it's a cat which has got a black nose, ears and tail. And if it's a male cat, it's got black testicles as well. Okay, and the Siamese cat is a genetic mutation. It's a change in the DNA, in the genes. We know exactly what's gone wrong. We know where it's gone wrong. We know the exact DNA base in the DNA chain. We know exactly what's gone wrong there. If we do breeding experiments with other cats, the pattern follows exactly the rules that Mendel found with peas. So it's genetic. I'm very, very happy to accept that. It's certainly genetic. It's certainly true. But, crucially, it's also environmental. Because the reason the cat has got that strange pattern is that the enzyme that does the job of making melanin can do its job well in the cold parts of the cat's body, where there's less spare energy running around and bashing the biochemical process, but it does the job much less well in the warm parts of the cat's body. That's the main body mass, which is 1 or 2 degrees warmer, more than the nose, the ears and the tail, and the testicles, which of course are both literally and metaphorically the coolest part of any male body. They're black as a result. And if you want to make a dark-coloured Siamese cat, you can do it by breeding for many generations from dark-coloured Siamese cats, or you can take a Siamese kitten and you can keep it in a cold room and it'll be much darker. If you want to make a light-coloured Siamese cat, you can take a Siamese kitten and keep it in a warm room and it'll be much lighter. If you want a very expensive black cat, take a Siamese kitten and keep it in a refrigerator and it'll be a black cat. So that the Siamese characteristic is absolutely genetic but also absolutely environmental. And the two are working together. And that happens again and again and again. And we can see it happening in a dramatic way in our own lifetimes. When I was born, which was 75 years ago, depressing but true fact, I was born at the end of the Second World War, and then after the war there weren't any real famines, but there were certain food shortages and there were what we call rationing. They were of course much worse in Russia than they were Western Europe, much worse in Germany too. But people were forced to eat a very simple diet, and in retrospect it was a very healthy diet. Very little sugar, very few cakes and so on, almost no butter, all this kind of thing. And so people were generally rather thin. Since then things have changed dramatically. In those days, and indeed in the 19th century, and indeed in Russia in the 19th century, if you read Tolstoy and so on, it turns out that one of the defining characters of the ruling class, the rich, were that they were fat. The peasants were starving. They were thin. And the same was true here in Britain. If you read Charles Dickens, many of his rich characters in London of the 19th century, they wore top hats and they had cigars and they were obese. The poor people were thin. We've now seen an astonishing reversal of that. When I give lectures of this to my UCL students here, I look at them and they're a highly intelligent and very middle-class group, and to a person, I don't think there's a fat person in the class. But if I go to a working class part of London, obesity is a big problem. In America, it's a major problem. Life expectancy in the United States is dropping fast, and the reason for that is obesity. Why is there obesity? Because food has basically become free. In the 1930s in America, it took a working man, and it would have been a man more than half his working week to get enough money to buy food for himself, his wife and 2 children. Now it takes him on average less than a day to do that, as long as he buys cheap, nasty, sugary, fatty food. So that food is now everywhere, universally available, and so people eat that food and they get fat. And in fact, we know a lot about the genetics behind that. There is strong evidence, very strong evidence, that individuals with particular genes, if they eat a lot of food, become fat. But those genes only ever manifest their effects in a place where food is cheap. It's a Siamese cat phenomenon. If there's no food, it doesn't matter if you've got genes that make you fat, because you're not going to get enough food. But the effect is big, and these genes have a very surprising place where they work. They don't work in the intestine or the liver to change your metabolism. No, most of them don't. Instead, they work in your brain. Nearly all of them are appetite genes. We have all kinds of hormones that change our feelings of hunger. Insulin actually is one. In fact, the first hormone ever found, I have to put an advertisement again in for University College London, was found here, just about 200 yards away down there, and that was actually a hormone called ghrelin, which was an appetite hormone discovered in 1903. Okay, and we all know the feeling of hunger. We're hungry. So we go to McDonald's, either in Paris or London or Moscow, and we buy some junk food and we eat it. I don't eat it, and I bet you don't either. But people eat it and they say, oh, that was nice, wasn't it? And I think, oh, God, not for me, thanks. But you don't then go again and buy another cheeseburger and another milkshake or a third one, because you have other hormones that come in and say, you've eaten enough. These are what we call satiety hormones. Stop eating. You've got hunger hormones and stop eating hormones, okay? Occasionally, very occasionally, people are born who don't make these hormones. So they're always hungry. There's one of them that's called leptin, and one birth in 50,000 or 100,000 is of children who are born with no leptin. And so as babies, they're always hungry. And they're not just pretending they're hungry, they are screamingly hungry. And so, of course, they scream and they yell and make a fuss. And their parents, of course, are very upset by this, so they give them too much food and they become morbidly obese. Now, fortunately, we can actually treat this with injections of leptin. But that's the nature-nurture thing. These genes for obesity, or not obesity, these hunger genes, have been around since humans evolved. But they've only become a problem in the last 20 or 30 years, when food has become free, effectively. So that's nature and nurture working together. And there's a second subtlety, which people really don't like to think about, which is that these genes work in your mind, okay? And they definitely work in your mind, and people find that very disquieting, that your appetites are changed by your DNA. Well, I say, well, it's a hormone. There's another hormone that shows the nature-nurture thing very well and works in your mind, and that's testosterone. That's the hormone, of course, that makes us men the wonderful creatures that we are. Women have it too, in much smaller doses, but that's why some elderly women grow moustaches as they grow old. Women have a little bit, but men have a lot more. And testosterone is nasty stuff. It makes men live shorter lives. It makes them much more liable to infectious disease, because testosterone suppresses the immune system, and it makes them much more likely to get involved in being murdered. Okay, so testosterone changes your behaviour, and we know very well the way it does it. We know a lot about the biochemistry. Bodybuilders, for example, who use testosterone to get big muscles, they tend to die for male reasons. They're murdered, they die in car crashes, they commit suicide, that kind of thing. So testosterone works on your mind. But one of the things it definitely does is to change your propensity for violent behaviour. All over the world, men murder at 10 times the rate of women. The murder rate in Britain is fairly low. It's not as low as in Singapore. The murder rate in Colombia, in South America, is 100 times the murder rate in Singapore. The murder rate in the United States is 5 times the rate of the murder rate in Britain. Okay. Now, the testosterone is exactly the same in both places. But in Colombia, there are drugs, there are gangs, there are weapons, there's poverty, there's unemployment, there's violence, and this puts part of the population at genetic risk. They're known as men. They have genes that put them at risk of murder if they're placed in a murderous environment. If you want to get rid of murder, you do what the people in Singapore and in Britain have done. You get rid of guns. You cannot get a gun in this country, a pistol, it's impossible. Ditto in Singapore. You try to improve living conditions, you try to reduce unemployment, and all this works. So you're solving a genetic problem by changing the environment. And that probably is the take-home most important message you can take from the modern world of human genetics. When I start teaching my students at university about genetics in their first week at university, and they come to my first lecture and they don't know what to expect, but I suppose they think they're going to learn about how genes rule everything. And to suggest that might be true, or to hint that it might be true, I ask them first of all to look to the person to their left and the person to their right. And they do that, and then I say quite accurately that 2 out of the 3 of them will die for reasons connected to the genes they carry. Now, I don't know which two, but it is the case that about 2/3 of the people today will die from conditions like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, all of which have certainly got a strong genetic component. So the students look a bit depressed by that, and I then say to them, but cheer up, because if I'd been giving this lecture in Shakespeare's time, 2 out of every 3 of you would be dead already. And that's true, because in Shakespeare's time, 1600s, only 1 English baby in 3 lived to be 21 years old. Even in Darwin's time, beginning of the 1900s, only 1 English baby in 2 made it to be 21 years old. But in modern times, 99% of English babies or European babies or most parts of Russia's babies make it to be 21 years old. And that's because the way we die has changed. We used to die of things like cholera, of cold, of starvation, in London of the terrible air and the fog, and that's more or less been conquered. But we all have to die at the end, in the end, and what we die now of is our own inborn weaknesses. So that might suggest that genetics is some kind of terrible fate, which you can be told when you're young what you're going to die of. But it's not really like that at all, because actually genetics simply tells you what kinds of environments, what kinds of nurture you are most at risk at. That's what I want to explore in this lecture, is the lack of connection between what the general public think of as genetics and what genetics really is. Genetics is a statement of what's dangerous or what's good for you in the world outside. It's not a statement of fate which can't be changed by the way you act. Now, I can illustrate that in various ways. One of the ways I like to do it is with cats, and cats have got lots of genetics, as do dogs and mice, but cats are perhaps nicer than either of those. And there are plenty of mutations in cats, and many people know about black cats and white cats, and famously there's this cat called the Siamese cat. The Siamese cat, of course, has got a white body and a black nose and ears and a tail. If it's a gentleman cat, it's got black testicles as well. Now, what's happening with the Siamese cat? Well, it's got a mutation, a genetic change, an error in the biochemical pathway that makes the black pigment melanin. And if you've got a black cat, it's got black melanin pigment in its hair. If you've got a white cat, then the machine that makes melanin, which is a bit like a factory, which has various steps on it, one of those steps is blocked. And so the material comes along and is stopped and it can't go any further, and you've got a white cat. The Siamese is a fault in that machinery, but it's an interesting fault because the machinery isn't broken, it's just damaged. And that means that the machine will work in conditions which are favourable for biochemical machines. In other words, in places where there's not too much energy when it's relatively cold. And what that means in turn is in the relatively cold parts of a Siamese body, that's the nose, the ears and the tail, and of course the testicles, which are both literally and metaphorically the coolest part of any male body. In those relatively cold parts of the body you have black pigment. In the relatively warm parts of the cat's body, which is the main body surface, you don't have any black pigment because it's too warm. And if you want to make a dark coloured Siamese cat, simply take a Siamese kitten and keep it in a cold room. You've got a dark cat. Or if you want a light coloured Siamese cat, take a Siamese kitten and keep it in a warm room and you'll get a light coloured cat. So that the Siamese gene, the mutation, which you know really everything about, we know where it is, what's happened in the DNA, what's gone wrong in the pathway, that gene is greatly altered in its effects by the environment in which it's placed. And that's true of things much more important than Siamese cats. It's true actually, it's behind the biggest epidemic that the human race has faced since the Great Plague. And the Great Plagues, of course, were in the 16th century, a bit later perhaps into the 18th century in parts of the world. It's been more or less conquered now, but we're in the middle of one which people haven't noticed. And that's the plague of obesity, of being overweight. And what's amazing about the obesity plague is how recent it's been. If you look at the figures for the United States, for people who are very fat, not just a little bit too fat, but morbidly obese, as we say, who are really almost circular and certainly have difficulty in walking and might even have difficulty in standing up, some of them, the number of those people in the United States has gone up in proportionate terms by something like 10 times in the last 30 years. So if you go back to 1985 and you draw a map of American obesity, there's only about 4 or 5 states, most of them in the South, where more than 1 person in 10 has that problem. If we look at the figures for 2015, just a year or so ago from when I'm now talking, there are now more than half of states where more than 1 person in 3 has this problem of morbid obesity. And that's really, really important for health, because if you're obese, you have all kinds of problems. And the biggest and the most intractable problem is a condition called type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is like type 1 diabetes, an inability of the body to deal with sugar. Now, both of them have to do with hormones. Type 1, as everybody knows, is an inborn and genetic failure of the ability to make a hormone called insulin. And insulin is actually an appetite hormone. It controls your sugar levels, and when your sugar levels go wrong, you feel hungry, okay? But these kids don't have insulin, and if they're not treated with insulin, they will certainly die. But we can treat them with insulin now, so that's fine. But type 2 is more complicated, but it comes when you eat far too much starch and sugar. Your body begins to say, metaphorically, look, the cells say, we don't want any more sugar, thank you very much. We're not taking any more sugar in. And so the sugar accumulates in your bloodstream, and it does all kinds of damage, and the damage it does is devastating. It can lead to blindness, it can lead to heart disease, it can lead to brain damage, it can lead quite quickly to ulcers which don't heal, so severe that many people with type 2 diabetes have to have an arm or a leg removed. It can lead to kidney failure, and in Britain, where we have this problem, not as much as in the States, half of the people on kidney dialysis machines are there because of type 2 diabetes. So what's it due to? Is it genetic? Or is it environmental? Well, at first sight, it might seem obvious it has to do with the environment, with the presence of extraordinary amounts of very cheap, low-quality food. And to an extent, that's certainly true. If you look at how long it takes the average working man, and I do mean man in this context, because we're talking in historical terms, to earn enough money to feed a family of 4, in the 1930s in the United States, it took the average man 3 full days of work just to get food for himself and his wife and 2 children. Last year, it took the average working man about half a day to get enough money to feed himself, his wife and 2 children. But of course, what's got cheaper has been low quality food, overwhelmingly sugars, fats, sweet drinks and that kind of stuff. So you could say, well, obviously this is due to an environmental change. The environment has changed. We have this new way of eating. We don't take exercise anymore. We spend our time looking into computers. So we've got fat. It's entirely environmental. Well, it's certainly environmental, but it certainly isn't entirely environmental. In fact, it's what we call the Siamese cat of diseases. Because what happens is that some people, because of their genes, are uniquely at risk of falling prey to this terrible new environment. Now, obesity runs in families. Fat parents tend to have fat children. So you might say, if you were naive, that proves it's genetic. But actually, it's an interesting fact, not widely known, is that fat parents tend to have fat children and fat cats and fat dogs. And that's not because they share genes with their cat or their dog, or at least I hope they don't. It's because they feed their pets too much in the same way they feed themselves too much and they feed their children too much. So you could say, well, it's genetic. But actually, it's more than that. We've talked about a fat cat a second ago. Let's talk about fat mice. About 20 years ago, a mutation appeared in a laboratory line of mice called the obese mutation, where suddenly we have these inbred mice, all of them with the same genes, all of which were almost completely circular. They weren't like mice, they were like guinea pigs, they were almost round. And they ate and ate and ate. If there was plenty of food, they just ate and ate and ate. And that was due to a mutation in a hormone, like insulin. It's a protein hormone that's called leptin. And we now know that it's an appetite hormone. But it's not like insulin, that when you're hungry, insulin builds up and you go out and get some food. Leptin does the opposite. When you're eating, leptin builds up and you feel full, you stop. It's what we call a satiety hormone. And these poor mice don't have any leptin. They've got an error in that gene. And so however much they eat, they will always feel hungry. And they will continue to eat until they're physically unable to do so. They will get very obese. Very occasionally, about 1 birth in 30,000, children are born with this condition, and they eat and eat and eat, and they get very obese. But you can cure them by injecting them with leptin. So the genes are involved too. Now, one of the great failures of modern genetics is its failure to understand most of the things in human society which are inherited. Things like human height. It's obviously the case that tall parents have tall children, short parents have short children. There's obviously a lot of genes out there. The environment's evolved too. But we haven't been able to find those genes. Or to put it another way, we found too many of them. The last time I looked, there was something like 150 genes whose variation was behind human height. And altogether, they only explained about 5 or 10% of the variation. So it was a big surprise to find that there are a number of genes in the audience to this program of people who have different genes which don't appear to be abnormalities like leptin deficiency, but which alter the extent to which they feel hungry. Okay? And the first one was found in a very typically unexpected way in mice. It's called FTO in mice, and that stands for fused toes. Okay, and fused toes, as you might guess, it causes the mice to have its fingers and toes fused together. Okay, so as humans sometimes do. Well, that's not very interesting, except that when you search the human genome for FTO, you find it there. You find exactly the same change in humans. But the thing which is quite bizarre and reminds us how little we know about genetics is that in humans it's an appetite gene. Now, I happen to know that I've got 2 copies of the DNA letter A, AA, at a particular point in this gene. About a quarter of the European population has 2 copies of the letter T in that position. And the rest of the population, about 60% or 70%, has 1 copy of A and 1 of T. Now, if you look at people who've got TT versus people who've got AA, right, they've got no knowledge whatsoever that this is the case. However, on the average, the TT people weigh 3 kilograms more than the AA people. And that's because this gene is active not in the stomach or the liver, but in the brain. It's an appetite gene, just like leptin. It makes you feel hungry, okay? And it makes you, or actually this one makes you want to stop eating. And the people with AA, the fatter ones, they need more food in order to stop eating because of their genes. And now we know something like 30 or 40 genes of that kind. So an awful lot of variation in people's appetite is genetic. Okay, again, just like Siamese cats. But of course, when we were talking about Queen Elizabeth's time, or Shakespeare's time, or Darwin's time, for most people in Britain, for most people in the world, that was quite unimportant because there wasn't enough food around, however hungry they were, to allow them to become obese. Now there's an infinity of food around, and for some people that's a big risk. Okay, and we're in a unique moment of human history because for the first time ever, the fat are the poor, and the rich are the thin. And that's a complete reversal from what was the case only a century ago. And that's because of this new emerging interaction between nature and nurture, between genes and environment. Now, people don't like to think that somehow their genes are changing their behavior. People find that a very, very uncomfortable feeling. But it's true. And I can end up by illustrating that with one obvious case in which it's true. That's another hormone, a hormone which about fewer than half of all biological scientists have now got, and that's testosterone, the hormone that makes men into the wonderful creatures we are. Now, male behaviour is quite different from female behaviour in many ways, some of which are obvious and some of which are not. Men are much more willing to take risks than women are. 4-year-old boys are twice as likely to be killed by accidents as men are. Men are 3 times as more likely to be hit by lightning than women are. That's because they go on a golf course with a lightning conductor in their hand, or they climb up to a tall spire or something like that. So that men don't live as long as women, partly because of their biology, of their hormones. Men are murdered at 5 times the rate that women are. To make up for that, men murder at 10 times the rate that women do. And that's universal across the world. The murder rate by men is 10 times greater than the murder rate by women in Britain and in, let's say, the United States. The figures are almost exactly the same. The same in China, the same in Singapore, the same in Russia, the same everywhere. But the interesting thing is the murder rate in Britain is about 25 murders per million people a year. 10 times more of the murderers are men. The murder rate in parts of the United States is 250 people per million per year. 10 times as many murderers are men than are women. So what are we going to do to solve the problem of murder? Well, we'll do what we've already done in most of Europe. You can't get guns. There's no need to be frightened. There aren't people chasing you around. People control their anger. So we can change our behaviour with social means. But that doesn't alter the fact that the genes are certainly important. So that's the odd message of this brief lecture, really, which is that the more you understand about genetics, the more, not the less, the environment seems important.
My interest is in behavioral genetics. It's looking for genetic influences on why people differ in behavior. So some people become schizophrenic, some children have reading disability. So I'm interested in what causes those differences. And for a century in psychology, people assumed all that's important is the environment, and especially the environment your parents provided in the first few years of life. That's from Freud onward. But what we've learned using behavioral genetics is that DNA differences between people account for almost half of the differences between people. This is far bigger than all the other effects in psychology put together. So not only does genetics matter, it matters a lot for almost all areas of psychology: mental health and illness, cognitive abilities, personality, school achievement. We call it nature is genetics, nurture is environment. So this is the longest standing controversy in psychology, nature and nurture. For a long time, people thought everything that we are is due to nurture. We've shown that nature, genetics, is very important. This goes back 100 years or so when the first behavioral genetic techniques were developed, twin studies and adoption studies. The first ones were done in the early 1900s, primarily in England, but also in other countries of Europe. And the twin method involves comparing two types of twins. 1% of all births around the world are twins. 1/3 of those are identical twins. They're called monozygotic because they're one fertilized egg, a zygote, that they're like clones of one another. They have the same DNA. The other type of twins, 2/3 of all twin births, are called dizygotic, two zygotes. They're like any brother and sister, but they happen to be born at the same time in the same womb. So the twin method consists of comparing these two groups. If a trait, say like musical ability, is influenced by genetics, you'd have to predict that the identical twins are more similar than the non-identical twins. So it's like a biological experiment. And what twin studies have shown us, in a recent survey of 15 million twins that have been studied in 4,000 papers, everything is heritable. Not just in psychology, but in physiology, skeleton, bone length, density, everything about individual differences in biology and behavior are substantially influenced by DNA, inherited DNA differences between us. So the twin method is one method. The other method is the adoption method. So the twin method is like a biological experiment. You've got these two types of twins. Adoption is like a social experiment. Nature and nurture run in families. So for a long time, psychologists knew schizophrenia runs in families. No problem. That's the environment. That's because the parents did weird things to them. The parents made them schizophrenic. But they ignored the possibility that genetics is important because genetics runs in families. Parents and offspring are 50% similar genetically. So the adoption method says, let's look for genetic parents and environmental parents. Because kids adopted away at birth, those parents still gave them their genes, but they don't see those parents. They're their genetic parents. But adopted children that are adopted into adoptive families where the adopted parents are environmentally related. So it's a straightforward, powerful test of genetics because it predicts that these biological birth parents who don't share environment with the kids, how similar are they to the children is a direct test of genetic influence. Similarly, how similar the kids are to their adoptive parents is a test of environmental influence. So the twin and adoption studies have convinced people that genetics is important. So much so that we've now challenged psychologists to come up with any trait that is not heritable. So we've gone from thinking nothing's heritable to realizing everything's heritable. And what we're now doing is using these techniques to study more interesting issues. For example, about development. How early does genetic influence appear? And there have been and the interplay between nature and nurture. And I'll just give an example of that. We have hundreds of measures of the environment that are used in social sciences. Life events, things like financial disruptions, stressful life events, are used in several thousand studies. But it's just been assumed that environmental measures are environmental. But what we've shown, many people around the world, these environmental measures show almost as much genetic influence as other psychological traits. And when you start thinking genetically, you say, that's not crazy. What are these measures? It's not the measure of the environment out there, which is the way psychologists used to think of it. The environment's what happens to us. What's going on is that in psychology, our environmental measures are measures of our experience. So life events, it's like financial disruptions, having trouble with relationships, getting in fights with people, losing your job. This is not the environment out there that happens to you passively. You don't have anything to do with it. It's what you do with your environment. And that's where the genetics comes into it. So that's a good example of how a genetic perspective has changed the way we think about the environment. And I believe it's a fundamental principle that the way genes work is through their correlation with the environment, how we use our environment. For example, I study cognitive abilities. The most heritable measure out of the hundreds of measures of cognitive ability is vocabulary. And so people say, so I'm talking about individual differences. Some people have big vocabulary, some people don't. And you don't inherit the words. It's not in your DNA because of different languages, for example. What it is a propensity to use language, to be cognitively aware of the subtleties. I have one grandchild who always wants to know, she's about 7, the nuances. Well, does that word really mean this or does it mean that? I've got another grandchild who says, whatever, you know what I mean, what does it matter, And that's how genes begin to work, is you begin to use your environment. You hang out with people who are like-minded. The one grandchild will be hanging out with other kids who read books, who are interested in intellectual conversations. Language development has been studied a lot. Children differ greatly in how early they learn to speak. Einstein didn't begin to speak till he's about 3. And also how they develop throughout life in terms of verbal fluency, how easy they find it to talk fluently, and also vocabulary. So that's your first language learning. So an interesting question that behavioral geneticists have begun to address is about learning a second language. How does that fit with it? And it turns out that many of the same genes are involved. So people who are good at verbal measures in their first language will tend to be pretty good in a second language. But there are some specific genetic factors. So the bottom line of that research is that about a third of the genetic influences on learning a second language are overlap with the ability to learn a first language. But about a third of the genetic effects are different. And then about a third overlap with just general intelligence. These twin and adoption studies have been used for most areas of psychology that involve individual differences. That is, we're only asking about what makes people different. 99% of all our DNA is the same. We're all identical. But we're asking the extent to which the 1% of DNA that differs makes people different. That's what we're doing in behavioral genetics. We're studying differences. So much of psychology and the life sciences is not asking about individual differences. They're just asking about universal questions about the human species. But we're asking about, why are some kids reading disabled, others not? Why are some schizophrenic and others not? A real transformation of research in this area. Up until now, people have been concerned about just simply asking whether genetics is important, and then asking how important. That question's been pretty much answered across the board. There's some people who still don't accept it, but the vast majority of people do. Not only is genetics significant, it's very substantial for almost every area of psychology. That's been so well ingrained that it's no longer interesting to say this trait is heritable, because everything's heritable. We go beyond that to ask questions about development, about the relationship between traits. Like a big issue right now is in psychopathology and mental illness. There's all these different diagnoses. It turns out that genetic effects are pretty much the same. That is, the same genes are causing many of these so-called different disorders. So that's an example of a multivariate approach. And a third area, first development, second multivariate, the third area is the interplay between genes and environment. If both nature and nurture are important, as they are, because genetics doesn't account for all the differences, it's usually accounting for about half the differences. So if nature and nurture are important, a lot of research is interested in how they work together, the interplay, the correlation and the interaction between genes and environment as they affect development. But the biggest thing of all is to go beyond heritability to say, let's find the genes. So that's sort of molecular genetics, and that's the hot thing now. Things are heritable, fine. Let's find the genes, because if you can find the genes, you can do so much more in terms of research, but especially in terms of translation to important problems. DNA is the best tool we have for predicting problems, which allows us to intervene to prevent problems, which is the way all of medicine is going. You know, rather than waiting until you're alcoholic and then try to cure that, until you're obese and try to cure that. If you can predict who's going to have those problems, you could intervene to prevent the problems, which is much more cost-effective for the individual, but also for society. So the excitement now is about trying to find these genes, and we're at the turning point where we are beginning to find genes which will allow us to make individual predictions about genetic risk and resilience, you know, vulnerability and strength, which will eventually allow us to predict problems and then hopefully begin to prevent them. Behavioral genetics has been going on for over a century. The modern era began in 1960 with a book called Behavioral Genetics. But people have been interested in nature and nurture for recorded history. Animal breeders knew that you could breed for behavior. And most animal breeding involves behavior as much as it does biology. You know, you think of all the dog breeds, they're mostly bred for functional behavior, for very specific things like pointers point and scent hounds smell. And it's hard to get another breed to do that. You try to get a collie to point, you know, they won't point. Try to get a pointer to round up sheep. You know, so for a long time we've known that genetics is important, but psychology rejected it for humans. You know, fair enough. But after a century of research, things have changed dramatically. Most psychologists now accept an important role of inherited DNA differences. So much so that it's no longer interesting to say, oh, here's another trait, another measure. Let's see if it's heritable. You can save time by just saying, yeah, it is, it's going to be. We've got to ask more interesting questions, and the big one is, can we find some of the genes? And that's been a revolution, and it's just now reaching a point where we're identifying some of the genes to be able to make individual predictions. And this isn't just psychology, this is all of the life sciences. They've all come to this position. Everything's heritable. Let's find some of the genes. Because if you can find the genes, you can understand pathways between DNA, RNA, metabolism, proteins, brains, and behavior. And so that's the original goal, is to find some of the genes so you can really understand the mechanisms between genes, brain, and behavior. But what we've learned from these new strategies that just came out really in the last 10 years or so, called Genome-wide association studies, where you have a little chip the size of a postage stamp, and it allows you to genotype hundreds of thousands of DNA markers throughout the genome, which are the 23 pairs of chromosomes, 3 billion base pairs of DNA. You can tag it throughout the genome. So genome-wide association study is an atheoretical approach to find the genes for heritable traits. The biggest thing that's come out of that is that the biggest effects are much smaller than anyone ever thought. So the biggest effect we know of for, say, a complex trait is one gene called FTO, which predicts body weight. how heavy you are, corrected for height, called body mass index, it's called. Well, that accounts for about 1% of the variance in weight. But that's by far the biggest effect that's been found. And 1% translates to this. It's a stretch of DNA that has two forms, A and T it's called. If you're AA, you're 3 pounds lighter than the average. If you're AT, you're average. If you're TT, you have 3 pounds greater. So it's like a 6-pound difference. That's what 1% of the variance is. That's the biggest effect. The average effect sizes are less than 0.01. It's really like 0.1%, 0.1% of the variance. Incredibly tiny effect. That's the biggest effects. And what we're guessing now is that the smallest effects are very much smaller. So if we're talking about here are the biggest effects, the smallest effects account for most of the heritability. So what that means is we're not looking for the gene or even a handful of genes. We're now talking about thousands, tens of thousands of genes that we put together in what we call a polygenic score, multiple gene score. And we're now beginning to use those to predict genetic propensities in a population. So for height, we can now explain with DNA alone 20% of the variance. With weight, about 15% of the variance. So that means the difference, the thing here is you could predict that at birth about an individual. And in psychology and psychiatry, we're nowhere near that. With schizophrenia, people say they can explain about 10% of the genetic risk with DNA alone. With these, they're called chips, these little postage-sized stamp slides, in a way, that you use to genotype DNA, that you just get from saliva. So to detect these small effects, you need huge samples. So the sample sizes are in the hundreds of thousands. So you need hundreds of thousands of people who have been genotyped on hundreds of thousands of SNPs, we call them, single nucleotide polymorphisms. It's just a DNA variant. And that's what we need to be able to detect these tiny effects. But when we get up to those sample sizes, we are detecting those effects. So for behavioral traits that I study, like intelligence, 6 months ago, we were able to explain 1% of the variance. We can now explain 5% of the variance. With educational achievement, though, we can explain 10% of the variance. So that means you take these tests, in England we have these tests called GCSE, which all children at the age of 16, at the end of compulsory schooling, have to take, national exams. We can explain 10% of the variance on that. Now we just got started, and we can explain 10% of the variance. It's about 60% heritable, so we've got a long way to go. But with 10%, what it means is if you take the top fifth, in terms of these genetic scores, we call polygenic scores, the kids who are in the top fifth are 65% likely to go to university. The kids in the bottom fifth are 35% likely to go. So even with only explaining 10% of the variance, that's a pretty big difference in terms of predicting at the high and low extremes. So I'm really into this because I want to be able to predict genetic strengths and weaknesses at the individual level. That's not to say, it's not like family risk. If you had a first-degree relative who's alcoholic, you have a 5-fold greater risk of being alcoholic. But so does your brother, because it's just a family risk. That doesn't work for people because there's big genetic differences within a family. You and your brother can be genetically quite different. But with DNA, you're able to make a specific risk. We could say you're at risk for becoming alcoholic, your brother is not. And what that would mean then is if you guys drink the same amount of alcohol, you're going to become alcoholic. Your brother won't be. This is just, in terms of the genetic prediction. It's not all genetic, but it's saying that genetics can make a pretty good prediction about some of these things. And when we do that, it'll change research because it's so cheap to do this now. These chips I talked about, when I first did it, they cost about 3,000 pounds. They're now 40 pounds. It's cheaper than much of the stuff we do in psychological research. You need big samples to find these polygenic scores. But once you find them, you can use them in studies, in small studies, like in neuroimaging studies or in psychological studies. So it's going to change the face of research because we're going to get DNA on everyone. Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institutes of Health and was the director of the Human Genome Project, he says that within a few years, all newborns will not just be genotyped on a chip. Their whole DNA sequence of 3 billion base pairs will be sequenced, and you can put it on a little memory stick. And once you've done that, that's the end of genotyping and collecting DNA. You don't need DNA anymore. Everyone will have all their DNA bases on this memory stick. And then we'll use that then to create these polygenic scores to make genetic predictions of risk. And for me especially, what I'm interested in is reading disability and reading ability are highly heritable. What we do now is we wait till kids get to school, they fail at reading, and then we try to do something to fix it. You could predict which kids are likely to be at risk. And we already know that almost all kids who are reading disabled had language problems earlier. You can't do reading interventions in 3-year-olds because they can't read. But you can do language interventions because there's very good language programs. But an important point is most successful interventions are expensive and intensive. So you can't do them with everybody. But if you could identify the kids who will be at risk for reading, you could intervene with language. And it wouldn't hurt them. It's not like giving them a drug or something. It's only good, to have people helping you with your language. And then when they go on to school, they'll be less likely to have a reading problem. So all of science, medicine now is focused on predicting and preventing problems, rather than waiting until the problems occur and then trying to fix them. So this is beginning to happen now. People are doing it on their own. 23andMe is this company that will do this for you, this genotyping, for about $100, for example. So lots of people are doing it, and they're beginning to do it for their children. The reason I think it's important to get this message out now, before it really hits the ground, explaining 10% of the variance is a lot. If you want to predict like school achievement, what would you use to predict that? Nothing else will get near this 10%. 10% is a lot, but we've just begun. People don't even know about this yet. But when they do, I think they will begin to take genetics seriously in education. Right now, they totally ignore genetics. And I think there are some very good things, there are good discussions that ought to begin now before this really becomes reality, even though it's getting close to reality already. And I think, a lot of people say, how terrible this is. Imagine you're going to predict which kids have reading problems. I think that's good. Now, there's a lot of doom mongers who say, oh, you label kids. Well, kids get labeled already. There are problems. We got to discuss those problems. But I'm a cheerleader for this. I think we can do a lot of good at predicting and preventing problems from occurring. But even right now, before we find the genes, we've got to start realizing that genetics is very important. It accounts for far more variance than anything else. And what that does is it makes us recognize that people differ genetically. It isn't all due to learning or willpower or personality. It's DNA differences from early in life. And when we recognize those differences, we might respect them more. So I think one message that comes out of genetics is tolerance. Like right here in the UK, weight is a major issue, the obesity epidemic. And people are seriously saying that overweight people should be made to pay for the disorders that occur. They ought to have to pay for their National Health Service because it's their fault. They're fat. Why don't they just lose weight? But if you recognize the genetics, 70% of the differences are due to genetics, you realize it doesn't mean you can't lose weight. If you stop eating, you lose weight. But if you're thin, you don't recognize how difficult it is for someone with a genetic propensity to put on weight and to have great difficulty losing it. It's just a lot harder. And with a reading disability, it doesn't mean genetics means you're not going to teach kids to read. It just means some kids are going to find it much more difficult. And we need to recognize that instead of, say in the case of education, blaming the schools, blaming the parents, blaming the kids, and with obesity, blaming you for being a slob. Just get a grip, have some willpower here, lose weight. And, so I think if we recognize it's easier for some people to say that than other people, we might become more tolerant. But at least what it will do is have us realize people are different. And that suggests that medicine, we talk about precision medicine, that's basically genetics. Not prescribing drugs one size fits all, not having a national curriculum one size fits all, but recognizing that people differ genetically and they need interventions that are personalized to them. So I think that's one of the big messages that come out of this, even before we identify the specific genes that are involved. One of the areas of research I study is genetics and intelligence, and it's one of the oldest studied questions in behavioral genetics, going back to the late 1800s with Francis Galton here in England. He was the cousin of Darwin, for example, and the gentleman scholar did his research in his home and that sort of thing. But he did some of the first work on intelligence, and he did it very badly. He just studied reputation, people who were thought to be very intelligent. But what happened in the early 1900s is people developed measures of intelligence. And even now, that's contentious for some people, but I think it's very well measured. And it began with Charles Spearman in England in 1904, where he said, intelligence just means too many different things to different people. I mean, what do you mean by intelligence, really? So he said, I'm going to define it precisely. G, general cognitive ability. And what that is what diverse tests of cognitive ability have in common. So you've got hundreds of tests of cognitive abilities, like different types of memory, different types of verbal, vocabulary fluency, spatial ability. There's many different types of cognitive tests, but they all correlate substantially, which is quite surprising to people. If you're good in verbal, it means on average, you're probably pretty good in memory, pretty good in spatial. People say, oh no, I'm good at spatial, I'm not good at verbal, or vice versa. But they are pretty good. They just mean they're better at this than that. They correlate substantially so that 40% of the variance, the individual differences of all those tests, are in common. And that's what we mean by G. The overlap, the covariance among all these tests. So it isn't a thing, it's what these tests have in common. So intelligence tests, they usually, the major ones used around the world, have about 10 different tests. They're different, some are verbal, some are non-verbal tests. They're diverse tests. And what you do is you put them together to get a score that people usually call an IQ score. So it's a pretty good measure of general cognitive ability. So general cognitive ability is important because it's the best predictor of societally important things like educational outcome and occupational status by far than anything else we have. They're also among the most heritable tests, and neuroscientists are becoming very interested in intelligence as well, because it's how the brain works. It's how the brain functions. And it doesn't function in the way most neuropsychologists think, as little modules in the brain that light up when you do functional MRI. The brain works, it evolved as a general problem-solving tool. And so it uses everything it's got to solve a problem. So some of the tests that we say load most highly on G, that is, they correlate most with this concept of G, are like abstract reasoning, problem solving in novel situations. And I think people just see that, if they just say, well, who do you think is intelligent? Why do you think they're intelligent? It probably has to do with stuff like this. It's not just how good you are on these quiz shows, like here in England we call it University Challenge, where you just memorize a lot of facts. That isn't really what we mean much by intelligence, although to be good at that, you have to be fairly intelligent. So I mention this, I emphasize this because some people say, oh, intelligence, what is that? Well, it's one of the best measured things we have. It's one of the most important predictors we have. So it's an important trait. It's basically learnability. And say in terms of education, which I particularly study, some kids learn more easily than other kids. Any teacher will tell you that. But instead of assuming it's all environmental, we've got to ask, is it genetic? And behavioral genetics over a century has shown that individual differences in intelligence are heritable. If you take the world's literature of several hundred studies, twin, adoption, family studies, you come up with an estimate of about 50%. But what's really interesting underneath that is if you ask about development, it turns out there's a linear increase in the heritability of intelligence from infancy to childhood to adolescence to adulthood. Infancy, 20%. Childhood, adolescence, 40%. Adulthood, 60%. Later in life, 80%. You first explain what heritability is. That's the extent to which differences are due to genetic differences. You ask them, okay, would heritability increase or decrease? People will say it decreases. Why? Because Shakespeare's slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, environmental differences, accidents, illnesses, they all pile up, which means that increasingly as you go through life, the differences you see ought to be due to the environment. But instead, it's very much the other direction. This has been replicated in many studies. You know, it's a really solid finding that heritability of intelligence increases. And so you ask why, you know, why does this happen? And it's what I was talking about before, that the way genes work is we don't program intelligence test scores in our DNA. It allows you to learn more easily, and you can learn more difficult subjects. And then you choose environments that fit that. You know, you like to learn difficult things, so you read difficult things. You argue with people. You know, you talk to people who want to discuss intellectual issues. And so you create environments correlated with your genetic propensities so that the little differences early in life, accounting for 20% of the variance in infancy, snowball. They increase as you go through life, selecting and creating environments correlated with your genetic propensities. So that's why I think the heritability of intelligence increases throughout life. And I'm particularly interested in applying these techniques to education. Psychology, about 20, 30 years ago, they didn't accept genetics at all. And now it's very dominant. Everyone accepts genetics. Education, however, is this backwater where they don't accept science by and large. You know, we spend as much money on education as we do on the National Health Service. The National Health Service now, if you have a new idea, a new program, you've got to show empirically that it works. You have to do randomized control trials. In education, people just use their hunches. And you see so many examples of this. I think they're going to have to deal with evidence and prove empirically, scientifically, that their programs work. And then I think they will take genetics seriously. Right now they just say, oh, well, that's just research and science, you know, that doesn't have anything to do with education. And it's bizarre because we find that cognitive traits and educational achievement are among the most heritable traits. You know, the kids in England are the most tested kids in the world. They have these national curricula and national tests that they take, you know, at different stages in education. We find in the first year of school, literacy, numeracy, the things we teach in school are about 65% heritable. The differences among kids, even as they go into school, are very substantially due to genetic differences. The heritability of intelligence goes up. So in the first few years of school, the heritability of school achievement, these test scores, is higher than the heritability of intelligence. Then as the heritability of intelligence goes up, it becomes about on a par with the heritability of educational achievement. There's a lot of interesting things here. We find educational achievement is just as heritable for, we call it STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, math, as it is for humanities, for example. So we also find that a lot of the genetic influence overlaps. That is, it's not just separate genes for learning math and separate genes for learning English. It's largely the same genes, and substantially, that's what we call intelligence. It's the same genes that affect all these different aspects of educational achievement. When we talk about intelligence, it's important to recognize that we're looking at individual differences, why people differ on intelligence or educational achievement. That's not to be confused with questions about why are humans more intelligent than other species, or are we, on average, more intelligent than people were before? However, there's quite a bit of interest in the issue of intelligence increasing. That's called the Flynn effect. He first noticed this. It's been quite a big increase in intelligence over the last at least few decades. It seems to have tapered off. Nobody knows exactly what that's about. Is it that we're becoming more sophisticated about test taking? Is it the way we standardize these tests? So it's not really clear. But what's important to recognize is that the causes of average differences, like average differences between us and people 50 years ago, or between sexes or ethnic groups, have no necessary relationship to the causes of individual differences. So a good example is the obesity epidemic. We're not only getting maybe more intelligent, we're definitely getting fatter, as all around the world in developed countries. That's got to be environmental. It's too quick to be genetic. But the heritability of weight is just as great across the years, across the decades. So the causes of individual differences, you might be surprised to know, most people are. We've done surveys of this. We ask, how heritable do you think height is? People say, really heritable, like 90% heritable, meaning most of the differences are due to genetics. Weight, not very much. I mean, 30%, 40% maybe, people say. It's 60, 70%. Most of the differences between us in weight are due to our inherited DNA differences. Even though we've been gaining weight over the decades, the heritability has stayed high because the causes of individual differences aren't necessarily related to the average differences. And a good possibility is that we have a Stone Age brain that wants fat. Fat is good if you don't know when your next meal is. But if you're in a fast food nation where you're bombarded by food cues all the time, it's harder to resist that. And so people who have a genetic propensity towards weight are going to put on that weight. It's interesting to think about this on the environmental side. Suppose, we're not talking about the average now, we're talking about heritability, that genetics accounts for a lot of the differences we see in intelligence. So what if you were able to make a more equal society? What that means is you get rid of the environmental differences. You stop privilege, parents passing on their wealth to their kids, for example, and giving them educational opportunities that other kids don't have. If you can get rid of the environmental differences, you don't get rid of the genetic differences. So that the heritability increases with equal environments. And that means that actually heritability is an index of social mobility, of equality. What's important about heritability, which is the extent to which genetic influences explain behavioral differences, we call it observed phenotypic differences. We're talking about in a particular population at a particular time with a particular mix of genetic and environmental factors. We're describing what is, what exists, not what could be. But now suppose those conditions change, as they could change over time in a population or between different populations. So say in a Mad Max apocalyptic world where the environments are completely different, how will that change heritability? It certainly could change it. It could actually make it greater because the genetic differences are more important. I mean, they're life or death issues that you solve all these new problems that you're confronted with. You can't just coast on automatic pilot the way we can in our, relatively civilized world where we know what's going to happen. We're not too often surprised. But so it's hard to know in the future, in terms of possible environments, what would happen. But what we do know is if you equate the differences in environments, you actually increase heritability. And I think that's a really interesting notion in terms of equality of opportunity and suggesting that heritability is an index of equal environments.
How are genetics, the study of genetics, relevant to education? Now, genetics, there's been an explosion of research, particularly in the last 20 years. What can we take from that that's relevant to education, that will be relevant to teachers? Well, one of the things that strikes teachers most when they're in the classroom is how different children are, how differently they behave, how differently they learn. And it looks like some of those differences between children run in families. So some children are brighter. Some children can run faster and are better at sports. Some children are more empathetic. Some children are more artistic. Some of these traits, some of these abilities run to some extent in families. And that might make you think that genes are involved somehow. So one of the ways you can think about this is to consider the idea of heritability. Now, it's a bit of a technical term, but what heritability means is the extent to which variation in a trait, like intelligence, like artistic ability, like sporting ability, or like something like height, the extent to which variation is predicted or explained by genetic similarity. So one of the ways that psychologists and behavior geneticists would investigate this idea would be to look at the similarity in a trait, let's say height, between different members of a family. So let's say you have a family with identical twins, they're genetically identical. You could see how similar their height is. And maybe very often they're quite similar height. And then you could just look at regular siblings within the family. Now, they're only 50% genetically similar on average, so that they're less genetically similar. And then you see how similar their height is. So maybe their heights aren't quite as similar as the identical twins. Now, the extent to which the identical twins, their height is more similar than the heights of siblings, that makes you think that genetic similarity is important in determining height. Now, you can do some maths here, you can put some numbers on this. Heritability is a proportion. Let's say that the proportion of variation in height, how much of that is coming from genes? Now, with height, it's something like 80%. So 80% of how tall a child is going to grow, you can probably estimate by looking at the height of their parents. 20%, that's coming from environmental sources, maybe something like nutrition, for example. Well, you can do exactly the same thing with education. Let me give you an example of a study that was run in the UK on a big sample of twins. And here the comparison was between identical twins and non-identical twins. And this was a study by Eva Krapol and her colleagues, and it was looking at the examination results of 16-year-olds across a range of topics. And they used this same way of assessing heritability, and it turned out that exam results were about 60% heritable. About 60% of the variation in how well you did in exams seems to come from your genes. Okay. Now, you may say to yourself, well, that's just intelligence, right? And everyone knows intelligence is like 50%, 75% heritable. Well, the researchers there attempted to control for that statistically. What they also did was measure some other things, some other abilities that seemed often to correlate with educational achievement. So they measured the children's personalities, they measured their health, they measured their well-being. They asked parents to fill in questionnaires about whether the children showed any behavioral problems. So all of these things show some correlation, some ability to predict educational outcome. It turned out all of those measures were highly heritable as well. Indeed, that set of measures, quite apart from intelligence, could explain the heritability of examination results as much as intelligence itself. So it doesn't look like this is all about genes for intelligence. Now, there was a follow-up study by a related group of researchers, a study where the lead author was Kylie Rimfeld, and she broke down the individual topics. So let's have a look at maths and art and science and business studies. Let's have a look about the heritability in those, and let's try and take intelligence out of it. Okay, so we'll just look at differences there. And what you can do in that kind of study is to try and work out whether the genetic effects there are the same or whether they're different for the different topics. So do you find genes for science and genes for art? Are they separate genes? And the findings were there that, well, the heritabilities was still pretty high, 40% to 60%. So there wasn't a lot of difference between the different subject areas, but it looked like it was the same genes. So there was some general genes making you good at education. Now, I think it's important just to step back a little here and say, well, what are these genes? All we've done is is we're making inferences that it's genetic influence based on the similarity between identical and non-identical twins. But actually we know that genes are regions of DNA, and they're stuck in the nucleus of cells, and they are either responsible for producing proteins or for regulating other genes producing proteins. So how is it that protein production in the nucleus of biological cells is having an effect on educational achievement? Now, that's a really complicated question, and we are some decades perhaps away from understanding the detail of the answers to that. We know what the explanation will look like eventually. It'll be in the details of biological development and cognitive development and the kinds of interactions that children have with the environment at multiple levels. So the biological environment, the physiological environment within their bodies, the physical environment they interact with, the social environment that they're in, and often that environment is specified by the child itself in these dynamic interactions. So it's a complicated story. Somehow genes are influencing that trajectory of development. But what you can do is you say, let's go right down to the low level of the DNA. And we know that human DNA, most of it's the same. That's what makes us humans. But in the letters of the DNA, there's some variation we find in populations. And we can correlate variations in DNA all the way across the genome. So maybe at a million letters, we can see how they're varying. And we can see what variation correlates with outcomes, say differences in educational achievement. Now, another study, it's a big study carried out on 120,000 individuals by the first author was Cornelius Reitfeld, but a very large study to get a sample that big. And they took a fairly broad measure. How many years did you spend in education? And what they showed was you couldn't really find much. The predictive power of the DNA itself, variation in the DNA and educational outcome, the effects were really small, the correlations were really small. And the only way you could even detect those correlations, they did find some, was by testing very large samples. So what that tells us is it's variations in many, many genes together that is producing variations in educational outcome. And indeed, there are puzzles, there are mysteries there, because the correlations that were detected between DNA variation and educational achievement, they only really explain 2% of the variation in educational achievement. But we know that heritability, what runs in families as it was, is about 40%. So using this method at looking at family similarity, we think that genes are responsible for 40% of the variation, but when we directly try and measure it, we can't explain anything like that. Still, there's interesting work we can do with that. When those DNA markers of variation were taken and applied to another sample, this was a sample of adults where there was a much longer lifespan trajectory, and you could see what events happened to those individuals over their lifespan. This was a sample in New Zealand. It turned out that those regions of DNA variation that were going to predict how well you would do at school, they also predicted things quite apart from education. For instance, your levels of economic achievement, so how much you would earn. There were some interesting correlations. If the DNA predicted you'd be better at education, it turned out that you were more likely to be in a better off family. The third thing that this study revealed was that having better DNA for educational outcomes, it didn't predict that everything was going to be better. Some of those individuals with the good DNA for education, they weren't any happier and they weren't any healthier. So we have this curious mix of genes having general effects for education across different subject areas, but not so general that it leads into other areas of their life. It may affect their earnings, eventually their success in life, but apparently not their happiness, apparently not necessarily their health. So we're left with some puzzles. I think when you start applying the idea of genetics to education, there are some questions you need to take on board. So many educators I talk with, when you say genetics, they go, well, that's such a deterministic and reductionist view of our children. And I want to make it really clear in talking about genetics and education. This is not saying that just because there's an influence from genes that outcome is determined. Indeed, part of what we're doing in studying genetics is to understand what environments can change educational outcomes. So I'll give a couple examples. One of them I'll make up, but the one that is real data is you can find that intelligence is quite highly heritable. I talked about that earlier. But if you look at samples drawn from quite poor backgrounds, the heritability goes down. So in those individuals, even if they have good genetic potential to do well, they're held back by their poor environment. So in that case, the high heritability, the strong genetic effect on intelligence in another environment, an environment with fewer opportunities, the genetic effect disappeared. So the second example that I'll make up is, it's more easy to understand this in the field of medicine. There's similar use of genetics to understand how better to treat individuals. But let's say I'd tested someone's DNA. And I could say to them, based on your DNA, I can tell if you get a headache that you should be taking ibuprofen and not paracetamol. And that's just due to your physiology. Or I could say, you're middle-aged now. Given your physiology, you really should be doing some exercise because your arteries might clog up. I could say to someone else, I've checked your DNA and you've got really good DNA repair mechanisms. You can smoke if you want to. It won't cause any problems. Now, in all of those instances, what I'm doing is looking at the DNA and making claims about what environments will be best for you. The best way to treat a headache, the best way to maintain health and fitness in middle age. So what we're doing in studying DNA is to try and understand the environments that give best outcome. And in the context of education, it's an attempt to understand the ways children will learn best, or other areas of their life like health and fitness, where we can put them in the best environments to achieve the best educational outcomes.
The United States, there's been a long-term debate about whether going to school makes you smarter, or whether differences in how smart people are basically determined by one's genetics, something that one's inherits, so that how smart you are is more or less determined at birth. This question became one of enormous national interest with the publication of a book by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray called The Bell Curve, in which they argued that one's genes were far, far more important than one's family or the environment more generally in success in life, and that the principal explanation for this was that people's mental intelligence, what we often call IQ, intelligence quotients, is something that's fixed throughout life. This book sold more than 500,000 copies. There are thousands of reviews with conservatives praising it as giving the correct understanding of the world, when liberals, in the most vitriolic terms, denouncing the book as just terrible and a bad piece of research. We have this interesting case where conservatives and liberals have just totally different ideas about sort of how schooling affects people's mental ability. The difficult question here is that we have a problem of selection, which is that people who get more schooling are in general smarter to begin with than the people who don't. And so the question becomes, can we figure out a way to separate out what we would call the causal effect of education, the effect that education has in terms of making you smarter or not, versus the fact that smarter people are are more likely to get more education than people who aren't, i.e. people who are smarter initially. So what I've done is looked at a national data set where everybody was given something called the Armed Services Forces test. This is the test that you take to get into the military. It's considered a general mental ability type test. We had about 6,000 people to do the analysis on. And we were able to see how people's mental ability changed as they aged, as well as changed when they got more schooling or when they had stopped schooling. It took some sophisticated statistical modeling I don't want to go into, but this allowed us to sort out the whole question. And what did we find? Well, we actually found a finding that made both conservatives and liberals unhappy. So if you look at the data, it turns out that going to school makes you smarter by a fair bit, but that right after you get out of school, you get dumber. So that part of what being in school, the way it makes you smarter, is you learn more, but just by being in school and taking lots of tests, you turn out to be a good test taker. So you see this very interesting thing where people are getting smarter as they age and stay in school, and then whatever point they stop, there's like this cliff that they fall off, and they lose anywhere from 30 to 40% of the overall effect of schooling. So I think this raises a very interesting question: is how should we think about this? What have I found? And I like to make the analogy to two things. One is athletic talent, and the other is music talent. So I'm a very avid tennis player. And if you think about tennis, there are three interesting aspects of it. One is it takes an enormous amount of national talent, and Roger Federer is in no danger of being threatened by me on the tennis court, and never would have been even if I had started playing tennis at 2 and played tennis, all my life. I mean, I'm an okay athlete. I'm not a great athlete. He obviously is. Second is I've never met anybody who had never played tennis who could pick up a tennis racket and play it at all well, no matter how good an athlete they were. It takes months of practice and stuff to learn how to play tennis. Tennis is also one of these sports that if you don't play for 6 months, you play a lot worse. So schooling seems a bit like tennis, right? Which is there are big, permanent, fixed differences. That's the ones that the conservatives like. On the other hand, you have to learn how to do it. That's the one liberals like. But you better keep yourself in shape. Or if I may give a parallel analogy, imagine being a concert violinist. Again, there are huge fixed differences in people's basic music ability. Many of us, no matter how much long we ever practiced the violin, would never end up at the Boston Symphony, one of the world's best. On the other hand, as many parents, including myself, will tell you, anybody who picks up a musical instrument, a violin, and starts to try to play it, there are many, many weeks before you hear anything that sounds reasonably like music, right? You're holding your ears for quite some time. But then if you do talk to a concert violinist, they will also tell you that it's very important that they practice every day. Because if you go weeks or months without practicing, they do a lot worse. So what are we finding here is that kind of mental ability, at least as it's tested or measured by these tests, seems to be like athletic or music ability. Yes, there are important individual differences. Yes, it's something you have to acquire, and it's something you have to keep up, which may well be an explanation why some of us have decided to spend the rest of our lives in school, though getting paid as professors. it's certainly going to be important to look and see whether the effects of schooling on mental ability differ across different demographic groups. Does it matter whether you come from a poor or rich family, minority, majority parts of the population, men versus women? We don't know anything about sort of the differential effects that education might have. And certainly also the question of sort of what, are the drop-offs as big at, say, at the end of high school as they are later? We have some suggestion that the drop-offs get bigger the farther out you go on education. And of course, education is not a singular thing, so we also would be very useful to look at types of education. Is it a more applied education, say going to business school versus a liberal arts education? Do those have different kinds of effects? And then questions about whether do different schools or different methods of education end up having different effects on mental ability. So, we've really started with this one very basic debate about whether education, you learn anything at all, does it make you smarter, to really there should be a much more detailed, finer set of questions of what kinds of education might or might not affect what kinds of mental abilities. Those are questions that need to be answered. I think the other point was by doing that research, it also helped us understand, better what these research methods are doing. There will be a very nice, what we call placebo test, which is in this data we actually have measures of how much practical education you have. What do you know about fixing automobiles and electrical mechanics and stuff? Well, if we find out that going to liberal arts college makes you know more about cars, I think that's going to raise very serious questions about how good the research is.
Twin studies are an amazing asset to science. They are a unique natural experiment, something you can do in humans that you can't do outside laboratory animals. It's the equivalent of cross-mating experiments in animals. Basically, there are two types of twin: identical twins who share all their genes, and non-identical twins who share only 50% of their genes. Both types of twin share their environments to the same degree. So if you want to find out if any trait or any disease is dominated by nature or nurture, by genetics or environment, you compare the similarities of these two groups of twins. And if you see a greater similarity in the identical twins compared to the non-identical twins, you know that that trait has to have a genetic component. And then you do some simple maths, which gives you a difference between the correlations, and you get what is called the heritability, which is another way of saying a proportion of any condition that's influenced by genes. So on average, for most of the human traits we look at, we tend to see around 60% of the differences between people explained by their genes. And twin studies are pretty much the only way you can get at this figure, the only way you can separate nature and nurture. Because if you just looked within a family at, say, a mother and a daughter, you might say some similarities, say that they were both on the large side or very short in stature, but you wouldn't know that's because they shared the same social conditions, the same food habits, malnutrition or overnutrition. So it's only by having this remarkable set of these two sets of twins that are otherwise identical in every way except for the sharing of the genes that you can make these clear distinctions between the two. And over the last 25 years, since I set up the Department of Twin Research here at King's College London, we've made a large number of discoveries in many of the common diseases diseases that people thought before were just either due to chance or due to age, just a simple wearing out of the body. And some examples are cataracts of the eye. When the eye fogs over, we now know that has a strong genetic component. Osteoarthritis is common in about 1 in 3 people, and most people know somebody, one of their parents, having it, and that has a strong genetic component, as does back pain, which people thought, oh, that'd be impossible, that back pain, that's just a mechanical problem. But no, that is 3 times more genetically influenced than something like breast cancer. So our studies, along with other twin studies around the world, and there are perhaps 6 or 7 large groups around the world that we often collaborate with, have made a very large contribution to understanding common diseases related to aging, but also moving into some other traits that people perhaps didn't think at all were genetic. Something like your preference for food, whether you prefer spicy foods or you like garlic. I personally thought that would be environmental, but it turns out actually that's quite strongly genetic. And whether you like Korean spicy kimchi or broccoli, or you don't like it, often these are strong tastes. Turns out that our genes are behind them. Then that also means that whether you like salads or you like fish and chips, unhealthy foods, junk foods, also has a genetic basis. So that was interesting. Then personality is another trait that has been known for many years, and in general, whether you're an optimist or you're an introvert, an extrovert, whether you're very conscientious, anxious, neurotic, about 50% of that comes from your genes and about 50% comes from your environment. Things like cigarette addiction, alcohol addiction, how much you drink, strongly heritable, strongly genetic. And then we have some other interesting traits, because we tested our twins here at King's College just before the last general election, when David Cameron was running for Prime Minister, and we asked the twins how they would vote, and it turned out that voting Conservative or voting Labour, so left wing or right wing, was 60% genetic. And so even something that we think is our free will turns out to be have an influence of our genes. And perhaps the one fact that surprises most people about twin studies, and something that we've also looked at, was belief in God. Now, religion, known as the opium of the masses by some, is obviously a very important aspect of people's culture around the world. But it turns out that whereas your religious affiliation, or whether you go to church or your mosque regularly, is not genetic, that's a cultural trait, what is genetic is how strongly you believe in God and how spiritual you are. And studies that we've done, and also in Finland, Netherlands, Australia and America, show the same thing, of a rate of a 50% heritability of belief in God. Now, what these studies all mean is that they're a starting point for the research in how you can actually find the genes underlying it. And so we can start by using genetic testing, using 1 million markers across many twins or unrelated individuals, comparing these genetic markers with these traits, whether it's back pain, whether it's breast cancer, or whether it's belief in God, and you can find the underlying genetic variants that explain these traits. And that's what we've been doing for the last 8 or 9 years, and we've discovered at least 500 genes in at least 100 traits and diseases. And nearly all these studies are done as global collaborative studies with colleagues all over the world, some studies as big as 500,000 people. And we've just finished a study recently looking at hair colour, where we took data from the British Biobank, combined it with some data from 23andMe, which is an American company that does population screening. People pay for having a test, looked at hair colour, and it turns out we have hundreds of different genes that control our hair colour, whereas we thought there were just a dozen before that. So these twin studies are a really nice way of starting off a new area of research, moving people to realise that nearly everything that distinguishes humans from each other has some genetic basis, meaning that we can understand the genes behind them, and that's why they're particularly exciting. Now, the other way of using twins, so I've told you about how you compare one with another, but if you take just the identical twins, the genetic clones, they're also fascinating because any difference between them can't be due to genetics, it must be due to environment. And we've also looked in this way at twins reared apart, twins where one is higher up on the social scale than the other, and we've looked at signs of stress, for example, and so that's the effect of being in a socially distinguished country where you have different social classes and the effects on health, and whether one is married or unmarried, things that are very hard to otherwise distinguish, where one is overweight and the other is skinny, or one is religious and non-religious, to look at those differences. So that's a really nice model as well that you can use twins, which is a bit like doing a lifelong clinical trial, but this way you have a matched clone who's gone through life either smoking or not exercising or doing something that you can compare to. So that's particularly good, and we've also been used it for something called epigenetic studies, which is complicated, but epigenetics is the study of how you can just switch on genes on and off, a bit like a light switch, with these chemical signals. And so even identical twins have different epigenetic signals, which explains why even identical twins often die of different diseases and have rather different profiles and personalities. So in the future, twin studies are really going to tell us a lot about ourselves. They've already told us how much we vary from each other and why we explain that. But I think we're moving away now from genetic determinism. We've gone through this last 10 years of saying genes are crucially important. We realised by studying identical twin pairs, the fact that they often go in different directions with the same genes shows that the genes themselves are not enough. There's many other factors that are playing on them that determine us, and so we're much more flexible than we believed. And I think identical twins particularly are going to be very useful for personalised medicine, showing us the limits of which we can predict how someone will behave based uniquely on their DNA and their genetic structure. Because by following these twins over time, we see very different trajectories. And the fact that if you follow them, they die of different diseases at different times, despite having the identical genes, tells you the limits of a purely genetic-based prediction. So I think they're going to be really useful for us informing us, showing it's actually much more difficult to predict how humans end up than perhaps we've been led to believe by other scientists.
Humans are absolutely fascinated by social behavior, social interaction. We think about our own social interaction. It keeps us busy, it keeps us worried. Social interaction, love, fight are also inspiring art, literature, poetry, change the world with war and all sort of more positive romantic adventure that we love to read or hear about. And so for a scientist, there is something very special about how we recognize each other, or more generally, how animals recognize each other. And one essential question to in biology or neuroscience is how animals recognize each other. Why is the recognition of individual within a species occurring? Are there specific dedicated brain areas that are specialized into recognizing other animals, and in particular recognizing an animal of the other sex in order to mate and to reproduce? Specific circuit and neurons dedicated to recognize an animal of the same sex that could be a rival, but also how to recognize our offspring, children or infants or pups in animals. All this recognition is absolutely essential. So in brief, an animal needs to recognize a partner or a rival or a kin. And so this is the type of question that we are very interested in, that have really intrigued scientists for a very long time. And at the earlier part of the 20th century, a lot of ethologists have asked this question. So Nico Tinbergen or Conrad Lorenz, observing animals very carefully and try to decipher the rules of this social recognition. So there is a very abundant literature of this time that is extraordinarily interesting, in which in particular, to give some excerpt, Tinbergen, for example, was observing sticklebacks, which are these little fish that have a very elaborate mating ritual, in which the male has a specific type of behavior that elicit a very specific set of responses from the female. This leads to the female to lay eggs and the male to then take care of the eggs together with the female. So there is really an exchange of signals between both that is extremely stereotyped. And so if it's absolutely identical from a set of individual to the other, then there must be something in the brain that fixed this behavior. The original question, the first question then to understand these behaviors is, what are the signals that elicit specific behavior? How does an animal recognize, oh, this is a female, this is a potential mating partner, or this is a male, I have to fight because that's a rival? And Nico Tinbergen, for example, who was extraordinarily influential and still is, discovered that animals often recognize each other not by recognizing a set of very complex features, but by recognizing what he calls sign stimuli, which are extremely simple features that in essence symbolize an entire stage or sex or gender or physiological status of an animal. And one discovery is led to a very famous anecdote. He had this stickleback fish in his lab, and he had mature males. And males develop a red belly, and that's a sign of a sexually mature male. And he realized, to his surprise, that every day, at the same hour of the day, these male fish were all adopting an aggressive posture, which is the head to the bottom and exposing their red belly. Every day, same time. And so he started to look what was happening at this time. And he discovered that every day at the same time, in the road adjacent to his lab was a truck of the mailman that was driving by, and that truck had a red color. And so it made him think that maybe this male fish identified this red truck as another male, and therefore all displayed this aggressive posture. So he tested this by showing to this fish a little decoy of a fish representing a fish quite exactly. And if that decoy was all very representative of the fish but without any color, it wouldn't do a thing. But if he took a very simple decoy that was basically just an oval shape decoy, but the bottom half was red, that was sufficient to elicit this very stereotype aggressive posture. And so from this and a lot of other experiments, he realized that all what the fish needed was to have this very simplistic representation of another male fish. And the sign stimulus of aggression was simply this oval shape with a red bottom. There are many, many more examples of this. The way the seagull recognize the newly hatched birds and start to feed them because they get a specific signal. All throughout examples of in fish and in insect and in birds, there are this very interesting recognition of simple signs. Scientists working with mammals try to see what are the specific signals that trigger social behavior. They try to impair vision, didn't do anything, to maternal recognition, for example. They tried to impair olfaction, didn't do anything. They tried to impair touch, it also didn't do anything. But if you impair several of these sensory modalities, then now the mom could not recognize their offspring in the rat, for example, or in other mammalian species. So from this came the really basic question of how do mammalian species or animals in general recognize their offspring or their mate or their rival? How do you analyze behavior? Well, you observe animals, and for a very long time, the way to observe animals was to go to the field and observe animals in their natural habitat. But there are very big limitations to doing this, because many animals go underground, for example, and so a lot of interaction are not visible. And then every person doing a field study will probably have different observation, because the system is not quite identical from one observation to the other. So a big revolution really came in the development of genetics, and a very big name in the field, a pioneer in the study of the neurobiology of behavior, was Seymour Benzer. Seymour Benzer was one of the pioneers in molecular biology, and he hypothesized that one could also study behavior by using genetic methods. And his model of study was Drosophila. And he simply tried to study mutants for specific genes and look at their impact on behavior. It was a huge bet, because many scientists at the time were saying, oh, behavior is much too complicated to be reduced to the function of genes. And I guess he had this intuition of the genetic basis of behavior from looking at simpler organisms such as viruses or bacteria. If you affect a gene, if you mutate a gene and it affects the behavior of a bacteria, why it wouldn't affect also the behavior of a Drosophila, for example, or other species. And so his studies, his experiments have been really, have revolutionized the field of behavior study or neuroscience of behavior. He isolated mutants of the circadian clock. He isolated a very famous mutant called fruitless, which is a mutant of sexual behavior. He identified mutant of memory, learning and memory. And so these were really the first examples of mutants, meaning a specific gene being affected and non-functional, being related to such a complex function as a behavior. And so from Drosophila, then other scientists got inspired to look at mice or a rat or other animal models. And one of the Drosophila is still a fantastic model system to look at behavior. Other invertebrate systems, such as C. elegans also, and they are extraordinary scientists right now working on these animal models. In mammals, the model of choice is the mouse. It's a system in which one can abolish the function of specific genes using genetic recombination or genetic engineering in general. And so the idea is to try to identify what are the key genes that affect specific behavior in the mouse. And we are particularly interested in social recognition, as I mentioned. And in the mouse, or rodents in general, the way animals recognize other mice is through the sense of smell. And so the olfactory system is really essential for the animal to be able to recognize its surround and to be able to recognize potential mates, rivals, kins, etc. The field of olfaction really was entirely revolutionized by the discovery in 1991 of the olfactory receptor gene by Linda Buck and Richard Axel. So they discovered that a very large family of 1,000 genes encode a very diverse family of receptors that are specifically expressed in the nose. And each receptor is able to detect or recognize a very specific set of molecules, of odorants. In rodents, there is also another set of olfactory neurons that are specialized into detecting pheromones. When I was a postdoctoral fellow in Richard Axel's lab and then in my own laboratory, I discovered the receptors for pheromones, receptors that are expressed by a set of neurons located in a part of the nose called the voronasal organ, or VNO for short. And so what we discovered is that the VNO receptors are completely unrelated to the odorant receptors. So the idea is that there is something very special about the molecules that convey social information. So pheromones are, by definition, molecules that are used by animal, released by animal to provide information about their sex or their physiological status or their genetic status. And so with the discovery of these VNO receptors, now we could address very specific questions about how are these social cues identified and what do they do to the brain. And we were able recently to pair specific receptor molecules to a specific source of information. And to our surprise, we actually discovered that many of these receptors are involved in detecting predators. So this set of neurons in the voronasal organ are not only essential to detect a female mouse or a male mouse or an infant mouse, but also a very large category of predators. Some receptors are specialized into detecting mammalian predators very specifically. Some are specialized into detecting birds of prey or reptile. Some receptors are even more specialized to detect one particular mammalian predator, let's say fox or particular type of snake. And so our work now in the future is to try to understand how is the specific information for a particular predator or a particular mouse, type of mouse, then relate to the brain. How does the brain make sense of these various signals? So the neurobiology of behavior is, I think, is interesting in many ways, but I think there are two very compelling reasons. One is the brain is here to organize behavior. That's the function of this organ. It's an extremely complex function, and we don't know anything about it. And so the hope is to understand the signaling throughout the brain. How does the brain decipher signals from the outside, computes them, and then comes up with a behavior. This is what the brain does, and addressing this question very specifically would give us insight on what is the biggest black box in our organism? That's the brain. We don't really know how the brain works. And this is a way to directly approach that function. The second very compelling reason is the fact that because in part we don't understand the brain, we also don't know how to diagnose mental illnesses, and we don't know how to cure or treat mental illnesses very well. If we understand some basic mechanism of how behavior is generated, then we will hopefully be able to have better diagnosis for disease like autism or schizophrenia or depression, where patients are really impaired in their social recognition and therefore in their overall behavior in society.
So when biologists talk about altruism, biological altruism, what they mean is behavior that we see in the natural world where an animal seems to be hurting its own chances of reproducing, and in such a way as to confer a benefit on another animal, so that the other animal seems to have its chances of reproducing increased because of the cost being paid by this altruist. So perhaps the best known examples are ants. Ants, fantastically social creatures. In the most complex social species, so-called eusocial species, really, there's the queens and there's the workers. And the entire lives of the workers, their entire developmental process, all of their behavior, is really dedicated to raising the larvae of the queen. So they're not raising their own offspring at all. They're helping to raise another organism's offspring, the queen's offspring. And this in ants is taken to spectacular extremes. There's some ants that the workers become living honeypots, basically, where all they do is hang upside down inside the nest from the ceiling and store a huge amount of liquid food in their bodies for the larvae to feed off. Their whole life is just spent as a kind of living food store. Incredible self-sacrifice, it would appear, by those ants. There's other species where the ants live in a nest, and at the end of the day, when nightfall comes, there's a risk of predators attacking the nest overnight. So these ants seal the nest from the outside, and they're stuck outside. They can't get back in, and they die in the night because it's so cold. But the rest of the colony inside the nest gets to survive. So those ants have stayed out in the cold, sacrificed their lives, it would seem, so that the rest of the colony can survive. Now these examples, they're biologically altruistic. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything psychological going on. Right? It doesn't mean that the ant is genuinely motivated by concern for the other ants. All we're saying when we say it's biologically altruistic is that the behavior really hurts the chances of reproduction of one ant and confers a real material benefit to the chances of reproduction for another. And this kind of biological altruism we see all over the natural world. We even see it among single-celled microorganisms. I think one of my absolute favorite examples of biological altruism is in amoebas. It's in an amoeba called Dictyostelium discoideum, where, for most of their life cycle, these amoebas, they're just like what we think of amoebas as being. They're just single-celled organisms living in the soil. But when food gets scarce, what they do is they detect how many other amoebas there are around them in their environment. And if they detect there's a lot of other amoebas close to them, they aggregate into a single slug-like thing, often called a grex or a pseudoplasmodium, a kind of mobile slug. And then they move as one in the direction of heat and light. It really looks like a slug, It really looks like these amoebas have got together, tens of thousands of them, and they formed a multicellular organism. It's incredible. But then when they actually get to a suitable place, they do something even more amazing, which is that they form a fruiting body, where about a fifth of the amoebas basically sacrifice their lives to form a hard stalk. so 20% of them die, they form this hard stalk, so that the other 80% can climb up the stalk and gather at the top and produce spores. And those spores drift through the air and they land somewhere where hopefully there's a bit more heat and light and food than where these amoebas found themselves. So if you think of those poor amoebas in the stalk, they are being just as altruistic as those ants. They're sacrificing their lives so that other amoebas can reproduce. Leading to the question, what is going on here? How does this sort of behavior evolve? Is this sort of behavior compatible with Darwinian evolution by natural selection or not? Because you might intuitively think, well, evolution by natural selection is this fiercely competitive process, this struggle for existence, this battle for survival, to use Spencer's phrase, survival of the fittest, where each animal is out for itself. Animals are just trying to survive and reproduce at the expense of others. And yet here we see in amoebas and ants and all over the place, animals helping other animals. What's going on? How can this be reconciled with Darwinian logic? Now, I think the answer to this question, basically, it was discovered by a scientist called Bill Hamilton in the 60s. He was a graduate student based in London, based at UCL's Galton Laboratory and also at LSE. Just had, in the early 60s, this incredibly seminal idea, drawing inspiration from two main sources. The first is R.A. Fisher. Fisher, really one of the architects of evolutionary biology as we know it. Really a great genius who founded the field of population genetics. In one of his books, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, Fisher just made this kind of throwaway remark, right, that isn't it kind of weird that insects are really distasteful to predators in some species? Because the insect doesn't really gain anything by being distasteful, because it's dead. By the time it's in the predator's mouth and the predator's bitten into it and eaten it, it doesn't really gain anything by being distasteful. But Fisher says, oh, well, it doesn't benefit itself, but it benefits the siblings. Benefits its siblings because that predator will be less likely to eat the siblings of this insect that it's just eaten and found really unpleasant. And Fisher says, well, of course, there's an evolutionary incentive there, although it's only half as great, he says, as if the insect had itself survived. The other key influence on Hamilton was J.B.S. Haldane, another key architect of what we call the modern synthesis, modern evolutionary biology as we know it. Haldane, there's a story about Haldane that may or may not be true, but I think is probably true, that he was in a pub one day, a short distance from here, near UCL, called the Orange Tree, drinking with his graduate students, one of whom was John Maynard Smith, himself went on to become a great evolutionary biologist. And someone asked him, what would it take in evolutionary terms to give you an incentive to jump into a river to save a drowning stranger? And the story is that Haldane sat and calculated on the back of an envelope for a few minutes and came up with this quip that, well, I'd jump into the river to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins. And the thought here is that, even under a ruthless Darwinian process of natural selection, actually organisms have an incentive to help one another sometimes. They have an incentive to help their genetic relatives. And the incentive to help is proportional in some sense to the closeness of the genetic relationship. So your evolutionary incentive to help your brothers and sisters is greater than your evolutionary incentive to help your cousins. What Hamilton did was, pretty much independently of Haldane, really took this insight, originally from Fisher, and developed it into a rigorous theory, a really powerful mathematical theory that's now usually called inclusive fitness theory, where what Hamilton did was show that the basic insight there of Fisher and Haldane can actually be captured in a surprisingly simple mathematical result. This is a result that's now come to be known as Hamilton's rule. Right? And the rule says that an altruistic behaviour is actually favoured by natural selection when a particular condition is satisfied. The condition RB is greater than C, where, to just explain those terms, C is the magnitude of the cost paid by the altruist, measured in terms of how much reproduction it sacrifices. B is the benefit that gets conferred on the queen or on another organism by that behaviour, again measured in units of reproductive success. And then R is what's called the coefficient of relatedness, a measure of how closely these organisms resemble each other genetically relative to two randomly picked organisms from the population. Now, a lot of debate has ensued in the past 50 years, about whether Hamilton was right or not, whether this rule is right or not. A large part of my book, The Philosophy of Social Evolution, is really about this debate and about the controversy that has raged about Hamilton's ideas. A lot of people look at this RB greater than C rule and think, how can it possibly be so simple? How can the mathematics of altruism just boil down to this incredibly simple calculation, just this cost-benefit calculation? Is RB greater than C or not? They think it's too simple. In fact, I think this rule is basically correct, but subject to a few qualifications, subject to a few caveats. First of all, it's important to realize that relatedness must actually be understood very broadly for this rule to be correct. It's not actually just about your family relations. It's not just about your kin in the ordinary sense. It's really about genetic resemblance, genetic similarity. To what extent do you resemble this potential beneficiary genetically or not? And sometimes you can get this genetic resemblance arising without any kinship in the ordinary sense. Richard Dawkins has a nice story in his book, The Selfish Gene, about what he calls a greenbeard gene, where the greenbeard gene has three effects. It causes the organism with the gene to grow a green beard. And it then causes that organism to go and seek out other individuals in the population who also have green beards. And then it causes the individual to behave altruistically to those individuals with the green beards. So it's causing this altruism. The altruism is not necessarily directed towards close relatives. It's directed towards other organisms with green beards. But Dawkins argues that's still enough. Such a gene can spread by natural selection. And the reason it can spread is that the benefits of the altruism produced by the greenbeard gene are tending to fall on other organisms with that same gene, other organisms with the green beard. And that's actually the way we should think about relatedness, not as requiring kinship in the intuitive sense, but just requiring that at relevant points in the genome, organisms share the same genes. The other qualifications, this RB greater than C rule, really what it's giving us is a snapshot of a really complex evolutionary process. The fact that it's satisfied at one moment doesn't necessarily guarantee that it will be satisfied the next moment. And also I think you should think of this not as providing the complete story, a full, complete explanation of why altruism exists in the natural world, but rather a kind of organizing framework, a framework in which we can then mount further investigations of the sort of actual ecological processes that can create positive R, or that can create positive B, or that can help offset the cost to the altruist. So really it's a starting point for further investigation of the real natural phenomena, rather than this kind of grand explanation that just explains everything. Nevertheless, I think Hamilton basically gave us the answer. He explained how altruistic behaviour can be reconciled with Darwinian logic.
Voluntary action is a topic which has often seemed right at the very edge of science, almost inaccessible to scientific inquiry. And I'd like to talk about some ways that we might begin to study scientifically this really important aspect of who we are and of our individual autonomy. So first we need to begin with a definition of voluntary action, or I would say a definition of volition. So we can use the word volition to mean the mental state and brain state which allows us to make voluntary actions. But it's actually quite difficult to come up with a good definition of voluntary actions. In our everyday life, we feel we know what we mean because we think that we can do what we want and we can decide on what we do, and our actions are up to us. If I feel like going to eat pizza, I will just go and eat pizza, and that's fine. It was my decision. But when we try to look at the problem scientifically about what exactly this means, it becomes quite a lot harder. There are really different traditions of defining volition. The tradition in neuroscience is quite rigorous in some ways, but unsatisfactory in others. In neuroscience, traditionally people have distinguished between actions which are reactions or responses to an external stimulus and actions which are internally generated. So a voluntary action, my decision that I'm just going to go and eat a pizza, that's up to me. It's internally generated. It's something that I decided to do. Whereas a reaction would be an action which is triggered by some immediate, obvious, direct external stimulus. So the classic example of a reaction is a reflex. If the doctor taps on my knee with a tendon hammer and evokes a movement of my leg, then that's a reflex response because it seems as though there is nothing more in the action than there was in the stimulus. But quite a lot of our actions don't seem like that. They seem to go beyond the immediate stimulus information, and it seems as though something inside me is adding the information about what to do, where to go, what the decision should be, and translating that into action. So that is interesting because it puts volition and voluntary action almost at the opposite end of the Pavlov tradition, which tends to see all of our actions as being responses to environmental stimuli. But it's unsatisfactory because it doesn't say what volition is, it just says what it is not. So a voluntary action is not a response to a stimulus, but then what is the cause of it? Where does it come from? What is the cause of the voluntary action? And in philosophy, they have an answer to that question. So they say that a voluntary action is an action which we make for a reason. So the test in philosophy for volition is, can you ask a why question? Why did you do that? Why did you eat pizza? Why did you cross the road? And that's quite tricky for us to study in the laboratory. It's quite tricky for us to generate the reasons for autonomous action in a laboratory setting. Because in a laboratory, we can give people a motivation to act. So for example, we can say, would you rather press this button and earn £1 or press this button and earn £2? But somehow that doesn't seem to be very voluntary because everybody is going to choose the button that gets them £2. And it seems as though actually it's the stimulus, it's the association with the value which is driving the action. So it's very, very tricky to think of situations which allow us to test this up to me quality in the laboratory. And that has been the tricky point about the history of studying volition scientifically. And the field really developed largely by finding new ways to measure the processes in the brain that occur when we do make decisions that are up to us. And it has not had so much success in trying to engineer or control the different ways that we can manipulate the situation and get people to make voluntary decisions. In 1965, Kornhuber and Dieker in Freiburg in Germany were able to record a potential, an electrical activity, by placing electrodes on the scalp. And they found that before a voluntary action, there was a reliable increase, gradual increase in brain activity, which they called the readiness potential, or Bereitschaftspotential, because they were working in German. And this activity seemed to come from the frontal areas of the brain, just in front of the motor cortex, which we actually use to move. And it seemed to build up a gradual electrical potential around a second or so before the person made a voluntary action. So the instruction that they gave to their participants was, press a button whenever you feel like it. Not when I tell you, but when you want to. So that is a quite strange instruction, which people sometimes find quite hard to understand. But let's imagine that they just occasionally make an action without any stimulus telling them to do so. The readiness potential seems to be something like the build-up of preparation in the brain as the person gets ready, go, and they press the button. So we now believe that we have a biomarker which can show us the emergence of a voluntary action, but we have not had very good ways of understanding, why does this biomarker begin? Why does the person decide to press the button now rather than 1 or 2 or 3 seconds later? And we recently published a paper in which we tried to address this question of what are the reasons for a voluntary action, using a slightly surprising task. So in our task, we told people that they should watch the screen and they should wait until the dots that they could see on the screen started to move either to the left or to the right. If they move to the left, press the left button. If they move to the right, press the right button. But you might have to wait a very, very long time before the dots start to move. You might just stare at the screen for up to 2 minutes waiting for the dots to move. That's really boring. And if you get bored waiting, you can skip to the next trial by pressing both the left and the right buttons simultaneously. Now, the critical thing is that that action, to press the left and the right button simultaneously, is not a response to the stimulus. There are no dots moving on the screen telling you to press the left or the right button. It's up to you to decide, now I'm going to press the button because I'm bored of waiting for the dots, I'm going to get to the next trial. So that is an action that is not stimulus driven. It's an action which is voluntary in the classic neurophysiological sense, because it's not a reaction to any stimulus in the external world, but it's an action that I make because I want to, because I'm bored. It's a little bit paradoxical that in this experiment we end up reducing free will to boredom, but it does fit with the classical definition that some of our actions are stimulus triggered and some of them are internally generated. And if you look at what happens before these skip actions that people make to get on to the next trial, you see the classic readiness potential. You see this gradual increase in electrical activity in the frontal motor regions of the brain, which builds up prior to the action. But the really interesting thing that we found is that this pattern of build-up is not just a reliable average that you see when you look at many trials grouped together. You can also look at the variability, the consistency, the reliability of brain activity. And as the voluntary action gets closer and closer and closer in time, the pattern of brain activity stabilizes and converges and begins to become more and more consistent, so that the readiness potential is not just a signal that you can see on average, but it also seems to be a pattern that the brain is trying to achieve before you make a voluntary action. And that seems to be relevant to an interesting question about whether our voluntary actions are purely random or whether they actually reflect some internal characteristic, distinctive process in our brain, because we make actions all the time, and maybe these famous voluntary actions, which we consider are so important for our free will and for our individual autonomy, maybe they're not controlled at all. Maybe they're just spontaneous bits of neural noise which we occasionally produce. Now, if our voluntary actions were just noise, you would expect the brain to be doing all kinds of things before the action happens. There'd be no pattern. But our data showed that before this voluntary action, there's a reliable convergence on a stable brain pattern. You don't just see a readiness potential in the average, you see the brain trying to produce this stable readiness potential pattern. And that suggests to me that there is a distinctive precursor or process that precedes our voluntary actions. Our voluntary actions are not random. We can see this emergence of neural activity in the frontal areas of the brain when there is an internal reason to act. In our case, this rather funny reason, I'm bored, so I'm going to make the action so I can do something else, get on to the next trial. But it means that we can talk about volition in a scientific way, and we can talk about voluntary actions and the underlying mental process of volition as part of our cognitive ontology. It means we're talking about something. There's a thing, a process that the brain is actually trying to implement, like perception, like memory, like emotion. And I'm perhaps less skeptical about volition than many neuroscientists. So many neuroscientists say, well, we don't have free will and volition is not something that exists at all and we can't study it scientifically, so let's not talk about it. That is the behaviourist tradition, the tradition going back to Skinner. But I think many of our actions are relatively independent from the stimulus environment in which we find ourselves. It's difficult for you to predict exactly what I'm going to do or say next, even though you have full access to the environment in which we're speaking now. You can see exactly what environment I'm in. This unpredictability about human action is not just randomness, but it's about the fact that each of us has reasons for acting. Most of these reasons may be quite simple. They may be things as simple as satisfying basic needs, hunger, thirst, and boredom. But these are processes in the human brain. We can study their brain basis, and we can identify the activities that occur in people's brains before they decide for themselves what to do. So the future directions, I think, for this line of research are to continue to try to understand the biomarkers, the precursor processes in the brain that occur before we act, to try to understand whether different reasons for action, different motivations for action, correspond to different classes of brain activity. So the example that I gave was boredom, but we will often act for other reasons. We might act just because we are nice people, for example, and we want to help others. What is the brain basis of that? I would like to know, because we should work on it. But also I think it will be important to understand when, during this precursor process that prepares our voluntary action and triggers our movement, when do we actually become conscious of what we're about to do? When do we have an awareness of the actions that we're going to make? And that's important because classically in our culture, actions are associated with consciousness. We think that we have the capacity to understand what we're doing and to control it before we do it, because we're conscious of the actions that we're about to make. So all systems of law are based on the idea that you are responsible for your action because you know what you're doing, and if it was stupid, you should have stopped yourself before you did it. But we don't really understand how that works in the brain, or indeed if it works in the brain. Some people think that brain science shows that the legal concept of responsibility is wrong. I think that's hasty. I think that's not true. But I would like to know, what is it about the action that I'm about to make now which makes me aware that I'm about to make it, and which is possibly relevant to whether I should have made it or not. So our legal systems all depend on a notion of conscious free will. And I would like to know, what is the thing, what is the process in our brains which allows that to work or not. I don't think I really believe in conscious free will. I don't think we're anywhere near as free as we think we are. But I think we might be conscious of our actions. I don't think that our experience of our actions is just an illusion. And I'd like to know about how that conscious experience is related to the brain mechanisms of control, because that's very relevant to how our entire society works.
When you try to understand how a car works, you are struck by how it's been engineered for a particular set of functions by human beings who have worked very hard on trying to optimize all the parts to make it work right. And of course, the car didn't come out of nothing. It came out of a development of a conveyor belt where parts were added and added. But ultimately, the cars can be understood in terms of its fully mature state. We don't have to go back and say, well, how did you make the steering wheel to understand the steering wheel? In the case of the nervous system, there's an interesting problem, especially with animals like human beings. And a good example of this comes from the fact that although there is an instruction book that makes our nervous system, it is our genome, our genetic heritage, many of the things we do with our nervous system, especially human beings, more perhaps than any other animal, a huge amount of our behavioral repertoire, if you will, does not come from our genes. If you happen to be born into a family whose parents speak Russian, you will speak Russian. That same child, if they're born or adopted at an early age into a family of people who speak English, will speak English. If you're given a tennis racket at a young age, you probably will play tennis reasonably well. If you're given a violin, you'll be able to play violin. If you're given a piano, you'll be able to play piano to some degree. These are not because you have genetic predispositions. It just happens to be that if you experience these things in early life, you have a greater skill with them in later life. And language is the most impressive example of all, that we all become expert at the language we learn, languages we learn as a child. And there's no genetics for this. This is not that you have a gene for that language. You just have an environment for that. So ultimately, your behavior when it comes to language, but also your behavior when it comes to buttoning your shirt or learning how to shave or driving a car or learning how to read or virtually anything an adult human being does, has as its origin the development of the nervous system in early life. That is, you can think of the brain as a learning machine rather than simply as a machine that gives you a behavioral repertoire. The behavioral repertoire it gives you is largely related to the behaviors you experience through practice and sensory experience in early life. However, once you've learned something, it's stably maintained in that nervous system, as if it were built in the way the behaviors of animals that are born knowing things come in. So for example, a dragonfly, you know, this animal that is an insect, it has these long wings and it catches mosquitoes. It unfurls its wings, and as soon as it flies perfectly with no practice. Built into its nervous system is a genetic instruction book that makes a flying animal that knows how to catch mosquitoes without any training. It's built in. You look at a human baby, you find a baby that does virtually nothing well. It can cough, it can pee, it can poop, it breathes, but if you turn it over, it can't even turn itself over. And it takes a human baby a year to learn how to walk. That's ridiculous. There's no animal that takes so long to learn how to walk. And in the United States, at least, another 15 years to get the driver's license. And 3 years after that, when you're 18, you finally leave the nest. It's a very slow process. And why would a nervous system develop slowly? I have students in my lab who are graduate students who are 26, 27. I have postdoctoral fellows who are still considered students who are over 30, We still call them trainees. We're still learning at this advanced age. And this is part of the great strength and weakness of being a human being. The strength is that we end up with a nervous system that is tuned to the world we find ourselves in. And the great weakness is that we are helpless for a vast part of our life. We are not self-sufficient until we're quite old. And if you want to understand how the brain works, you're basically going to have to understand how it is that information about the world gets instantiated into the physicality of the brain. And I'm going to give you one example of this. If you learn to ride a bicycle as a child, you pretty much have that skill for the rest of your life. And I, like most children from my generation, I learned how to ride a bicycle. And then when I was in graduate school, I did not have a bicycle. And then for the subsequent 10 or 15 years, I didn't have a bicycle as well. So there were several decades of my adult life when I never rode a bicycle. And then my wife and I moved from where I was living here, and I was beginning to grow, but not up, but out. I was getting fat, and my wife suggested that we get some exercise. So I went to a bicycle store, and I hadn't been on a bicycle for a very long time. And I got on a bicycle, and you know how it is at a bicycle store, they let you ride the bicycle a little bit outside. And so I was very nervous, but I got on the bicycle, and after, I was a little shaky, but it was only maybe 8 or 9 seconds. And then suddenly I was riding fine. So something about learning to ride a bicycle as a child was stably maintained in my brain. Whereas people who don't know how to ride a bicycle as a child, if you give them a bicycle as an adult, it's a very hard job to learn how to ride a bicycle if you've never had experience as a child. So something physically was changed in my brain that was stably maintained without practice for decades that I could use again later. In fact, all memories are like that. There are many memories that are buried in our mind that we don't have access to in the sense that we're not thinking about them, but if we're prompted, they can be brought up to the surface. They're just sitting there waiting for that moment. And there are probably lots of memories you have that will never come to the surface because nothing will ever prompt them. But what is the form of that kind of information? It's some kind of physical structure. It's probably in the wiring diagram of the brain, and it's probably through a developmental mechanism that allowed experience and use of an idea or a task to change the wiring diagram in a way that you now have a stable rendition of that skill built into the nervous system. And this is a deep and mysterious question of what do those skills and those memories look like physically? What is a memory? And that is really a developmental question. It's a question of how the brain goes from a state of not knowing things to a state of knowing things. How did that wiring diagram change over the course of experience? There are lots of things to say about the speed of learning. I think a lot of parents are eager to have their kids reading early and doing very well in school at a young age, the implication being that the fast learners are the smartest. It's worth mentioning that Albert Einstein didn't say a word until he was 5, and that many of the people who are most successful in fields seem a bit immature to other people. They're baby-like or more childlike perhaps than their more mature colleagues. I think we all go through this trend, but the people who go through it the slowest may be the ones actually who have the big advantage here, not the ones who do it fast. There are stories, and I've read an interesting book about this, of children who are remarkably precocious. They know how to do things at an earlier age than other kids. They are clearly what you would call a genius at a young age. And then this book traces their life trajectory later on. And they do learn extraordinarily fast, but they plateau just at an earlier age. And they don't necessarily become great thinkers. They just reach the adult state quicker. They just go through it at a much quicker rate. So I'm not sure that there's any real advantage to being a quick learner. Most important thing is, of course, to continue to take information in about the world. And maybe this is what separates humans from most other animals that have to survive on their own at an earlier stage, so they can't keep being in this learning state. They have to grow up quickly, and growing up quickly has a consequence. It may be that they learn less about the world than an animal that has the leisure to keep learning into middle age or even into old age. One of the interesting features of a brain whose behavior is generated by experience with the world is that if that's how people's brains are being developed, then the culture of a society is evolving due to the use of our brains in a particular world that is itself changing because of what people are doing in it. So there is this idea that in science fiction that our brains will get bigger and bigger and bigger, and we'll get smarter and smarter and smarter. I see something actually quite different thinking about it in this way, which is that as a community, human beings will do more and more impressive things as we join together. The internet is a good example of using many brains to solve problems and using technology like computers to solve problems. So humans will keep advancing, but there's no need for human brains to get bigger. There's only a need for human brains to allow this cultural evolution to continue happening. In fact, there may be a limit to what humans individually can know, and there's no evolutionary force to make us smarter. There's just an evolutionary force to make us work as a society, because as a society we become much more powerful than any one of us. And that is basically what the internet or countries or governments are. They're consolidations of human beings into bigger entities than a single brain. If the development of the brain is a critical part of its maturation into what it becomes, then we have to pay a lot of attention to early developmental influences. Early education, the noxious effects of abuse of children will have long-lasting effects on people's behavior by virtue of the fact that our brains are being molded by those experiences in a permanent way. And it is why adults in different countries or of different religious beliefs have such a hard time getting along, perhaps, because their brains, from a neurobiological standpoint here, have already made up their minds about the way the world is. These children would have gotten along, but by the time they're grown-ups, it's too late. And I think understanding this, almost in a political way, as a sort of policy way, might change the way you think about how we solve the world's problems.